Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 12 of the 2016 Tata Steel Tournament. Our competitors today, white is played by Fabiano Caruana, currently sitting in second place in the tournament standings. First place being held by the world champion Magnus Carlsen. There's a point difference between the two, so Fabiano, knowing that he only has rounds 12 and 3 left, he really needs to get some victories. Even if his, counterpart Magnus Carlsen gets a couple ties, he can at least tie. Hopefully, Magnus Carlsen falters, which doesn't look like that's going to happen. So, all in all, he needs a victory. His opponent, playing the black pieces, hometown hero Loek and Wely. We've covered a few of his matches. He's kind of have a tough go. He's played some of the strongest players in the tournament. He's one of the weaker players just by, if you look at rating standpoint. But all in all, looking to go out at the end of this tournament with some strong matches. So we'll go ahead and get started with Fabiano, starting out with pawn to e4. Pawn c5, knight f3, pawn to d6, pawn d4, capture, and then we get into the Najdorf defense. So one of the sharper lines that back can play usually results in a pretty dynamic game. And white has a few options. Main line typically to just start with pawn to e3, but Fabiano decides to go a little trickier route. He goes pawn to f3, pawn to e6, and then bishop here to e3. And this is a little interesting because after pawn to f3, sometimes black can play queen here to b6, and this sort of stops the bishop from coming here to e3, because then queen down here taking on b2. So usually white will, if he wants to play kind of this pawn here to f3, which usually signifies he's not going to castle on the king side, he's going to castle on the queen side and really start an attack on the king side. Usually he'll play bishop here to e3 first and then pawn to f3. But Fabiano decides to go ahead and change it up a little bit. Plays pawn here to f3. Loek does not decide to bring his queen out. Instead decides to play pawn here to e6. So now queen or bishop here to e3, followed by pawn to b5. So Loek says, okay, if you're going to start to attack on the king side, because essentially I know that's what you're going to do, I'm going to start to go ahead and develop over here on the queen side. Queen up here to d2, getting ready to castle on the queen side. Knight here to d7, and then pawn up here to g4. So it's kind of a both. Castle on the queen side, start to push forward on the king side. Pawn here to h6, and then castle on the queen side. And now we just start to push. Pushing forward with pawn here to h4. Eventually putting pawn here to g5, getting the rook over here to g1 if he wants to attack, push a little further. Over here on the queen side, though, black really needs to start to attack. It's going to be tough. He's going to use a lot of his moves developing to maybe castle on the king side, try to get some sort of safety, but by that time, white can kind of just blow up his king side. So he's going to be looking just all-out attack on the queen side. Now black's going to continue with bishop here to b7, and then pawn here to h4. And black kind of has two main moves here. He could start pushing first on the queen side, pawn here to b4 makes a lot of sense. Or he could start to just try to protect his king over here. If he plays bishop here to e7, then we're going to see rook here to g1, allowing himself to push forward with pawn here to g5. It gets pretty difficult. If black decides, I'm just not going to worry about you pushing forward, he castles on the king side, then pawn to g5 is pretty difficult to deal with. He kind of wants to move his knight, but if he decides to go ahead and take with his pawn, we have a recapture. He could even recapture with his bishop. Either way, the king side's kind of blown up from a safety standpoint. Now if he decides, okay, I'm going to just play pawn here to g5, we just see take, pawn recapture, we see the bishop recapture. All in all, this is not a safe way for black to defend his king. So he decides, okay, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to go ahead and push forward here on the king side, or the queen side. So pawn here to b4. The knight moves here to a4. Queen gets involved into the game. After pawn here to b3, just solidifying that knight. Then bishop here to e7. So it feels a little bit safer playing this now. And he also doesn't have to worry about castling on the king side. But this just gives him the option depending on how white continues. White continues with rook here to h3, and then knight down here to c5, attacking this knight here at a4. Now white has a few options here. His best move is to play pawn here to a3. It's a very tough move to really find, though, because you kind of look at it and say, well, this knight's already protected here on a4 by the pawn. So does this pawn here on a3 really help too much? It really does, and we'll get into that. But if you kind of look at it, it makes a lot of sense to start to continue just push forward here on the king side. The queen side looks like it's somewhat defended, but right away, black could just take here on a4 after the pawn takes here, then black could say, okay, I'm not even worried about castling on the king side. He can move his knight here to h4 or d7. I really like d7 just because he wants to be attacking on the queen side, so there's no reason to just have your knight hanging out over here on h5, completely separate from where you want to attack. So, after this, we could see the pawn take right here if he wanted to. Pawn could take if he wanted to as well. Bishop could even take since he has the defense by this queen right here, but after the queen takes, it just doesn't really look as clean from white. He doesn't have protection with his king. His bishop over here is kind of isolated by itself. The rook here on h3 isn't really doing as much as he wanted to. Instead, it decides when he comes back here that pawn here to a3 is actually probably the deferred way to go. Now, if the knight were to come here to a4, he's not going to take the pawn taking here on a4 first. Instead, he's going to take pawn here on b4 first. And now after the queen moves, he can take the knight here on a4, but only then. So if the knight were to, or the queen were to come back somewhere, let's say queen to c7 or something, after the pawn takes, this is going to be a much better position that white has on board. So after the pawn comes up here, black doesn't even want to take that knight right away. Instead decides to bring his rook over here to c8, putting more pressure on the semi-open c-file. White's going to continue with the pawn taking here on b3. Now after the knight takes, we see the knight down here, and after the queen takes here on a4, this is going to be fine for white. Fabiano plays the king to b2, and he's pretty safe. The queen's somewhat alone over here on a4. Can't really continue to push too much with an attack. He has the queen here on d2, which is protecting this pawn here on b4. So all in all, definitely recognize that although he wanted to push on the king side, and it looks pretty interesting, something that a lot of players would probably do, he recognized, hey, it was probably better to go ahead and protect myself a little bit more on the queen side because I still have this attack over here on the king side whenever I want it. Pawn here to d4, and then bishop here to c5. And bishop here to c5, it was almost kind of like he was waiting for this pawn to come here to d5, because this is a great outpost for this bishop here on c5. If the bishop were to take, the knight's just going to come to this outpost right here. This is very difficult to deal with. This light square bishop can't kick it off. None of the pawns can kick it off anymore, so this is going to be extremely good. So nice little move from here. Fabiano bringing his bishop here to c5. Now queen comes back here to d7, and then now and only now does Fabiano decide he wants to go and start pushing over here with his pawn here to a g5. So we see an exchange on board. Now the rook's going to exchange on board, and then a bishop here to h3. And you can see both these bishops doing work. This bishop right here on h3 is kind of stopping the pawn from ever taking back or moving really from this e6 square. This bishop right here is a great outpost, really just controlling a lot of the board past kind of this fifth rank right here. So a really good position from Fabiano. Knight over here to h7. Trying to just put a little pressure right now on the square here on g5. Pawn up here to f4, completely stopping that. And then all of a sudden you just have Loek over here with his knight on h7, not doing anything at all. So queen here to c7, now putting an attack on the square on f4, and then the bishop decides to go ahead and exchange on board, and the knight to c4. So as we discussed, once the bishop moves, now the knight just continuously takes the place of the bishop and has a great little outpost here. And before, Loek kind of had his knight where he could maneuver it to d7 and then exchange the knights on board, but his knight can't even do that for a while. So this knight's going to be kind of a pain for Loek to deal with for the rest of the game. Loek now plays pawn here to a5, just looking to break up this pawn. This outpost is just too much to deal with. Pawn up here to g6, forcing the knight to move. Knight to f6, pawn here to e5, just kind of forcing this knight to move around. But d7 is probably a good square for him. It allows this outpost to kind of get blown up a little bit. Decides to go ahead and take with his knight here on d7, knowing that the pawn here on b4 was going to fall. So after the queen takes, we see pawn up here to f5. And this is just all sorts of chaos for black as far as how he wants to defend this. He probably chose one of the worst ways. He played rook down here to c4. Maybe not sure if he recognized all the threats that he had going on in this position. But rook down here to c4. If he wanted to take the pawn, he could just take the pawn. Rook down here to c4 doesn't provide any value. Could play queen here to c7 if he wanted to, attacking the pawn here on e5. That's a pretty dangerous pawn. But after rook here to c4, we see pawn here to f6 check. After the pawn takes, we see the pawn take. Now he's kind of forced to play king here to d6. Now if he were to play king here to f6, it just gets really dangerous here. We see the rook here to f1. If the king were to move, the rook could just come up here to f7. He could decide to go ahead and take this pawn here on g6, but then just gets even crazier. We have a checkmate in a few moves. King here to g6. The king comes back here to h7. We get the bishop involved. All of a sudden, we have a checkmate. So there's no great way for the king to kind of dance around there. So he kind of is forced to move king here to d6. But then queen to h2 is maybe the move that he didn't realize in the game, but it's just very dangerous. King here to c6. Pawn up here to g7, getting ready to promote his pawn to a queen. That's going to be bad. So queen back here to d8, stopping that attack. A queen to e5, just centralizing that queen on board. Bishop here to c8, trying to hold the fort, but not really doing too much. Pawn here to b5, and the king can't really take here because now the bishop comes down here to f1, pinning down the rook. The rook's going to fall. This is just all sorts of bad. So the king comes here to b8. Now rook over here to g1. Didn't really have to play g1. He is trying to protect this so he can push forward with g8. But he could just play rook takes here on d5. If the queen takes, we see an exchange on board. Pawn takes. Now the pawn's going to come up here to g8 and get a queen on board. Know exactly what happens with that. If instead the pawn takes, then the queen can come up here to e7, attacking the king. The queen's pretty much forced to come here to e7. We see the pawn take. All of a sudden, white's going to easily be able to get a queen on board, so black's going to fall there, but decides to go for kind of a safer route, plays rook here to g1. But then queen to b6 just says, hey, you can just go ahead and get your free queen. I'm not even going to try to stop you. So pawn here to g8. Gets the queen, and Loek is forced to resign in this position. So Fabiano, great victory for him in round 12. Magnus Carlsen got a tie, so Fabiano going into the last and final round is only a half a point behind his opponent, Magnus Carlsen. Pretty interesting variation in the Najdorf defense, but thank you guys for watching, and I will see y'all in tomorrow's final round.